delighted to be with you folks today and spending some time talking about strategic workforce planning, and in particular, the question of where to begin. And so I'm looking forward to diving in. Brandon, I'm looking forward to talking to you a little bit about your perspectives on some of these things. And at the end, obviously, we'd love to have questions from all of you that are watching and listening today. So our agenda will begin with an overview of what workforce planning is. It's interesting timing. I just taught our course, Strategic Workforce Planning Certification, here in Philadelphia yesterday and the day before. And even among people that are spending a fair amount of time thinking about workforce planning, there are lots of different definitions. And so I think there are a few reasons for that, and we'll talk about those. Out of that comes really three questions, and questions that I think workforce planning in a variety of different ways can answer. The first of them is how to balance business growth with an agenda that is primarily finance-driven. The second is how to better forecast and align with the business on talent needs. And last but not least is the idea of what we would think of as strategic workforce planning's primary outcome, mitigating long-term risk, trying to figure out some way to avoid the icebergs that are out there and make sure that your business strategy can continue in the way that it's envisioned to. There are some common threads to all of those, and we'll talk about those at the very end of today's presentation. And then, as I said, we'll get to an opportunity to have some questions and answers at the end. So first, these are just a variety of different definitions, and you folks may be able to read all of those. If you can't, it's okay. I think you would find that they have somewhat similar threads to them as we think about what workforce planning is all about. Some people will say, as the dictionary.com says it's systematic identifications and analysis of what an organization is going to need. The Wikipedia definition says a continual process used to align roles and priorities. Those aren't bad definitions. And the one that's common out there, a lot of people talk about the 5 R's: right people, right place, right time, right skills, right cost. This is a fine definition also. But it is important to be able to get clear in your head as to what the outcome is that you're trying to get to, so that you can arrive at a definition of workforce planning that really produces what you want it to produce for you. So this is a slide that we use in our Strategic Workforce Planning Certification course, and we use it as a way to tee up the idea that even within workforce planning, there are a couple primary different outcomes. One of them we'd think about as being primarily operationally focused, so having a relatively short time horizon in which we are trying to produce things like staffing plans, or a year-long view of how to balance manufacturing needs in the manufacturing environment, relatively short-term, and the inputs to that are mostly internal data. So you're mostly going to be looking at your current state data. Now, it goes beyond a little bit of what we might think of in terms of data, but really understanding what you have in your HRIS and your other talent systems that will help you understand where you are against where you plan to be in a year. And operational workforce planning is an important thing to be able to do. It is certainly foundational to be anything to do with sort of the right-hand side of the slide. The right-hand side of the slide is about what we would call strategic workforce planning. And both the inputs and the outputs to this are different. The inputs to this are primarily external factors. It's looking at what are the big tectonic shifts that are happening out there. The classic one that all of us probably in business are thinking about is, what's the impact of changes to healthcare legislation in the United States, for instance? We don't know, but in terms of being able to think about our strategy, we probably want to be able to think about multiple scenarios. And so thinking about a long-term view of the future so that you compare for multiple possible futures is the primary output of strategic workforce planning. Brendan, what are your thoughts in terms of the way that your clients work on these things and separate these two outcomes?
Yeah, definitely. I think in talking to Workday customers, this really resonates in terms of a couple things. One, as you said, workforce planning means many things to many people, and so pinning down definitions isn't always easy. But no, what we've heard from customers is they need to do both operational and strategic, and then oftentimes something a little bit in between. And so I love what you've got here in terms of really crystallizing it to perhaps the ends of the spectrum, and then there's the ability for customers to potentially even dabble in between depending on their needs at the time. But I love how you've outlined it. It really resonates with what we've heard our Workday customers doing in practice.
Good. Yeah, I think that concept of sort of figuring out where you want to go, and yes, absolutely, it seems possible that you could do bits of both. You could at least dip your toe in the strategic workforce planning water while you're doing work that is primarily focused on an operational workforce plan. And it's interesting, we have an annual conference on the topic, which Workday has been participatory in the past. And at that conference, I would say a good portion of the presentations are about what we would think of as operational workforce planning as opposed to strategic workforce planning. And again, they're very closely related and have similar outcomes, at least at the short-term level. So as we think about how to build common understanding, I think one of the things that I find useful anyway is to think about the answer to the question we're trying to ask, and or which question we're trying to ask. And so none of these are particularly wrong definitions, but here are three questions that I think you might be thinking about trying to answer and have thought about workforce planning as a potential answer to. The first question is, how do I reconcile the headcount budget numbers that finance is giving us with our business plans? This is obviously an important issue for a lot of organizations. You know, as you think about history, HR and finance have always had this sort of love-hate relationship on this topic. You know, finance is giving a number to the business, saying this is how much you can grow, and HR and the business is saying, well, this is how much we need to grow in order to meet our business objectives. And HR is sort of stuck in the middle trying to say, well, how do we get those two things to come together? Because you're not going to get any more money, but we need to be able to take the workforce that we have and make it work to answer that question. We'll talk more about that one here in a second, because I'm going to start with that question. The second question that you might be trying to answer is, what will the composition of my workforce in both capability and capacity? And I'd like to continue to use those two terms as ways to think about workforce planning gaps, because you'll find that most of your gaps are going to be in one of those two categories. You're either going to have capability gaps, you need to be able to do some things that your organization can't do today, or you have capacity gaps. You need more people doing the things that you currently have. And so if we think about the second question, what am I going to have in capability and capacity gaps a year from now, maybe 2 years from now? And that's a different question, and there are some different things that we would suggest that you focus on as you think about the answer to that one. The third question goes a little bit farther out on the time horizon. Where are the major disconnects between our longer-term business strategy and the current composition of our workforce, and how do we avoid this risk? The very best stories about strategic workforce planning are stories that help organizations understand where they not only have gaps in how many people they have, they don't have anybody performing in a particular role that's going to be needed in the strategy that they're trying to execute in the future. And so these three different questions are all different questions that people might be thinking about trying to answer with workforce planning, and where you would begin would probably depend a little bit on which question you're trying to answer. So to get us teed up on this first question, how do I reconcile the headcount budget numbers that finance is giving us with our business plans? I'd like to bring back a presentation that we had at our workforce planning conference a couple of years ago. It was a gentleman by the name of Ross Sparkman. And at the time, Ross was running the workforce planning efforts at GE Aviation. He's since moved on to Facebook, at least according to my understanding from LinkedIn. But at the time, he was dealing with this very issue. And I think his answer to this first question maybe gives us some clues as to how we'd answer it. So let's go ahead and play the first video if we could.
Okay, so let's talk now about where we've in the past started to see even more confusion, and why, you know, our CFO and our HR vice president were struggling with this alignment piece. If you see the part of the chart that's blue, with the 433 number, we basically have time on the horizontal axis, and you'll basically just see that's our attrition forecast. So if you were to do absolutely nothing today, you would see that hire nobody through natural attrition and through the attrition modeling that we did, you would lose a certain amount of people that you would have to, in theory, hire through backfills. The red part, the red line, represents the demand that we just talked about. So if you're producing X number of engines today, and in the future that increases by X percentage, that's going to mean X percentage more people. So that's where those numbers are coming from. The confusing part, though, is now the green line, because this is the numbers that finance is giving to HR and is planning for. And I remember one of the struggles I had when I was really getting into this with some of our HR leaders was, these aren't the same numbers that finance is giving us. Why is it so much more, or why is it less? Why isn't it exactly the same? And I said, well, look at what finance is trying to do. Back to that operating margin piece. They're trying to reduce our costs, right? And by doing that, they're not going to give you an unlimited supply of money to buy a workforce. You have to become more efficient. You have to leverage skills across the workforce. You have to understand what regrettable attrition is versus non-regrettable attrition and leverage those levers to reduce that delta right there. So if you see the 536 and the 503 number, you're not going to get money for 536, but the 536 represents the growth in the business. So if you want to achieve that 7% revenue CAGR, that's what the business is telling you want to do, but they're not going to give you the money to do it. You have to find another way to achieve that efficiency. You have to find out a way to reduce the delta. And that's when we can really put on our strategy hats and say, okay, well, so we have to make up, this many people. We know we're downsizing another part of the business. Let's move some people over here. We know if we upskill the workforce here, they're going to become more efficient. We don't probably need as many people here. We know that if we can let some of those people that maybe aren't doing as well in the company go, not give them bonuses or whatever, we can reduce that delta through natural attrition. So there's a lot of different ways, and that's when we put our strategy hats on, and we think through this. And this is when HR really now becomes a strategic partner for the business. And these are real dollar terms that we're talking about here. This is a small little talent segment, but scale this to 45,000 employees, scale this to 100,000 employees. Now we're talking tens of, 20s of, 50s of millions of dollars.
So that's just a little bit of obviously a much longer keynote presentation. But the point that Ross is making is that if we are thinking carefully about what levers we can pull, given the amount of budget that we have, we can begin to make strategic decisions that are going to help the organization align the money that finance is providing with the business plan so that you can actually get alignment between where you're trying to grow to and what the organization has given you. So this is the slide that we use in our certification as well. We call this the 6 Bs. The original 5 Bs, by the way, came from David Ulrich, who's a professor at the University of Michigan. And he's the father of the HR business partner concept, a big HR fan and big believer in strategic HR. And he says that there are sort of 5 things that HR can do that are going to impact the business in a variety of different ways. And we call them the 5 Bs. We've added a 6th and added a layer of organizational design to it as well. But they are pretty simple, and you folks have probably heard of them. This is buy, so this is the idea of being able to bring in new people from the outside. But as Ross Sparkman just said, buy doesn't always work if you've got a relatively limited budget and you aren't going to get the full amount to bring in an entirely new workforce. And even if you did, that would probably have a bad effect on engagement and some of the other things that the build side of the equation would provide for us. On the other hand, sometimes if we want to build talent internally, we need to be able to have time to do that. People have to be able to backfill those other positions that people are going to grow into. So there's obviously there's some risk reward there as well. Oftentimes those different gaps between buy and build are filled by borrowing short term. So we can contract with some work for a limited period of time, maybe while some of the people that we're developing get up to speed. The idea of the latter B's here, bind, is making sure that while we are holding on to while we're bringing on new people, that we're holding on to the most important ones that we have. So the ability to really make sure that we're giving good reasons to stay at the organization for our highest performers. The 5th of the B's is bounce, and bounce sounds like we're bouncing them out of the organization, and sometimes that's true. But oftentimes it's taking people, as Ross Sparkman said, out of one part of the area of a company where it's not growing very quickly and it isn't a particularly critical need, and moving them through development programs over to another part of the organization where they can fill some gaps. And last but not least is the element of organizational design. Sometimes we need to fill these gaps by rethinking the way that work gets done and coming up with new reporting relationships or new team structures that allow work to get done in a way that probably wouldn't have been possible in the old team structure. Balance is doing all of these things together. And so the reason I wanted to show this to you folks is Ross lays out a nice plan. It sounds good from a conceptual standpoint. The question is how. On the opposite side, in our course, we talk about action planning at the very end of strategic workforce planning as being the primary output. And now we've identified gaps and we want to fill them. How do we fill them? And we give you these buy, borrow, build, buy, borrow, bind, bounce, balance tools as a way to think about how to do it. The connection point between those two things, how much do I need to do this, and this part, which is how to do it, is the answer to that first question, which is how do I get and balance the numbers that finance is giving me with the growth of the business. Brandon, is there anything you'd like to add as we talk about this, the end of the first question here?
No, I love how you've covered it, and I think it's really, just to kind of segue into that next part, all of these strategies are so essential to, a company's ability to grow in terms of balancing all those different factors and decision processes. So nothing more to add there, though, Bill.
Okay. All right. Thanks. Well, so the second question then really gets to this idea of operational workforce planning. And the second question is, how do we think about what we're going to need in terms of capability and capacity over the course of 1 to 2 years? And this might be a question, I would suspect that this is probably the most common question that people think about when they're trying to answer questions about workforce planning. And so to begin with this one, I'm going to propose to you folks that you, if you haven't already, think more about the concept of role segmentation. And role segmentation, to some people in HR, can feel a little uncomfortable because what we're really going to suggest to you is that some roles, not people, this is a role, it's about the jobs, not the people here in this discussion, but some roles are more important than other roles. They are more directly tied to strategy. Those roles are going to directly mean that whether the organization gets to the place that they're trying to go or not. And that doesn't mean that the other roles are not important. It just means that some roles are more directly contributory to who the organization is and wants to be. As you think about the different examples of the companies down at the bottom here of this page, and some of them we've heard from in various presentations, you talk about FedEx. FedEx is the world's largest airline, which is an interesting sort of factoid. We don't tend to think of it as a big airline just because we don't get to fly on it. But lots of packages fly on it all the time. And FedEx, as they think about being the world's largest airline, obviously have lots of different roles out of their thousands of different positions that they have at the company that they could think about as being strategic. One of the keys to this concept is to take a relatively small. And if you ask yourself what's the difference between the best pilot and the worst pilot, for instance, at FedEx, presumably all of them land the planes. So the best pilot maybe does the paperwork on time and maybe does some other benefits that makes it easier to work with them and can train other pilots and things like that. But the difference between the best courier and the worst courier, the person that's bringing your packages, is enormous. The best courier brings the package up and knocks at your door and leaves it on the porch. The worst courier leaves it at the driveway of somebody else's house in the rain. And so for them to be able to execute the strategy of really providing great service at a customer individual level, that role is more important than other roles. At Costco, where lots of people think about quality of products and the ability to get good deals, it's all about the buyers, the ability to get really good products in the door and provide customers the opportunity to get those at a reduced cost is something that the buyers make happen. In the Disney parks example, people often talk about the street sweepers, which is interesting. This came out of John Boudreau's work at USC years ago. But John makes the point that Mickey Mouse can't talk. If you've lost your hat or something bad has happened to you at the Disney park, the people that are going to help you are the people that are moving the trash barrels around and sweeping up and making sure the place looks nice. Sure, there's a help center, but the people that are actually able to interact with you and provide their mission of a magical day are actually those people that are in the street sweeper role. So the difference between people that are really good at those roles and just average means all the difference to the company. So that's one way to think about the idea of role segmentation. This is a spectrum of roles that we would suggest at HCI, and this is kind of a core piece of our certification course. We would suggest that you bucket your roles into 3 different groups. The first of them being strategic, and these strategic roles are roles that are directly aligned, like the examples I've just given you, toward the way that your organization competes and its strategy. Usually there are about 10 to 15% of organizational roles that we would want to consider strategic. After that, you get into another set of roles that are core, and there are more of these. Maybe 20 to 25% of your organizational roles are core. Most of your sales roles, you can't obviously operate very long without salespeople, so salespeople are generally core roles. Oftentimes, heads of departments are core roles. We don't want to be without these folks very long. A little farther down the spectrum, you see support roles. And because they're now down here in the third in the list, you tend to think, well, that means these are less valuable. No, they're all important to the company. It just is the alignment to strategy that separates these as being somewhat different. And so mostly HR roles are support roles, as are finance, as are IT. These are parts of the organization that are very important, but they don't define who you are. And then last but not least, there are misaligned roles. And misaligned roles are roles that probably are lined up to a strategy that no longer exists. And if you think about your organization and you look around, there may be some people that are coming to work every day doing just fine performance-wise, but doing something that doesn't quite matter as much as it used to. So a while back, we had Tracy Smith from FedEx, FedEx Express actually, talking about ways to work with business leaders on getting them to think about this idea of role segmentation, which is a critical part of it, because in order to make your workforce plans effective, you're going to have to get buy-in from your business leaders on kind of what the most important roles are. And she suggested 7 different ways to do it. I won't take you through all of those because it would be a little bit long. But in this video that you're going to watch next, Tracy talks about method 2 through 5 here. I'll tell you briefly about number 1. Method number 1 is basically just a 2x2 matrix. So in the 2x2 matrix, it would be the difference between how hard the job is to fill and how important it is. Okay, so really hard and really important, start there. That's not a bad way to think about it. It probably isn't the only way to think about it, though, and there are some other elements of this that we'd want to think about as we get into role segmentation. So let's tee this up, and we'll listen to Tracy Smith talk about 4 more ways to do this.
So the second method is based on complexity and criticality, and this one is looking at how complex are the skills to do the job? Do you have to work across organizational boundaries? Do you actually have a financial impact to the company? Are you linked to some of your very important customers? So quite a few factors related to that. But if I take that method and I try to put that on that same 2x2, well, if a job is a little more critical, it's probably a little more important to the business. And if it's a little more complex, then likely the skill sets related to that job are a little more specialized, and it would be a little more difficult to obtain in the market. So for me, methods 1 and methods 2 are actually quite identical. It's just a matter of which terminology you want to use between the 2. So the third method, so this one's a little bit different, and I like this one because it has a strong link to the strategy. So it's actually going to segment your roles into 4 different categories. The one at the very top are the roles that drive the strategy, so that's your core. And the roles that support the strategic core are your next one down, and it slowly moves away from how close your role is to executing that business strategy and making it a success. And what I like about this method is it's actually got a recommended action off to the right for you. So it tells you which ones you want to strengthen all the way down to which ones you want to redeploy. Now, the one disadvantage to this one and the previous methods is it's not explicitly forward-looking. So it's going to be a very good method if the competency sets in most of your roles are not changing very quickly. So for our business, that's actually fairly good, except when you get over into your IT section. If you're more of a technology, rapid pace kind of company, you'd have to consider that a little more. So you would have to keep your future roles in mind more if you wanted to use this method. So the fourth one by our host, the Human Capital Institute. So this one is very similar to the previous one in that we are going essentially from the critical roles all the way down to the misaligned ones. They have some key questions for this activity. So they ask which roles contribute more to strategic execution, which roles have the potential to accelerate achievement of the business strategy, and which competencies are vital to executing the strategy. And a good piece of this one is actually they give you they've provided some guidelines on roughly the percentages of roles inside your company that you could deem to be actually critical. The only time I could see maybe that critical piece being a little bit more, again, is if you were in a technology company doing a lot of fast-paced R&D. So method 5, it's coming from a book called The Differentiated Workforce. So put your hand up if you've heard that book, read that book. Okay, not too many. Okay, very good book to read. This one starts with 2 rather strategic questions. So they're going to ask, how will we compete, and what must we do exceptionally well to win? So that kind of heads into what is your strategic advantage. This one does not go straight to identifying the roles. The first thing that they're going to have you identify are what are the strategic capabilities that you need within your company. And then of that long list of capabilities, now select the strategic positions that are characterized by a significant amount of variability in performance. And this is along the logic of, well, if you have large performance variability, you're going to maximize your opportunity for improvement. So the advantage has a very strong linkage to the strategy. It is very forward-looking. The only disadvantage I can see to that is if you're going to try and communicate that method to your leadership for role selection, it might be a little too complex for some areas. So that's where you have to judge your own leadership.
So it's good counsel. This idea of role segmentation, as Tracy would imply in this video, can be pretty complicated. Sometimes people will think about it as difficult to be able to implement. But the idea of getting role segmentation right is that if we're really focused on the places where our bang for the buck is going to be the highest, where we end up feeling most confident that the roles that we're working on in forecasting are really the right ones, that our chances of being able to get these operational workforce plans to take hold and people to get victory through them goes up dramatically. And so it's an important sort of concept to think about. I will say I don't know why this says what is coaching. This slide should not say what is coaching. It should say something like types of examples of gaps. So this also comes from our workforce planning certification. In essence, when you think about your strategic roles, you're going to be thinking about whether or not you have enough people working in these places, often not, and whether they have all of the capabilities and competencies that they're going to need. And your gap analysis is very much the answer to that question. So you're going to be thinking about, okay, what do we have? That's our current state. And what do we need? And in between those things becomes this concept of a gap analysis. These are examples of capacity data. So obviously, how many people, but not just how many people that are doing these strategic roles or roles of interest. How many people, what is the attrition rate among people in these strategic roles? What is the ready now, ready in 6 months, ready in a year for people in these strategic roles? So it's taking many of the things that we think about in terms of traditional HR data, but filtering it out so that we're mostly focused on these roles that contribute greatest to strategy. These are examples of capability data. This obviously gets a little bit more into the idea of competencies. Do we have folks that have the right levels of competencies in these strategic roles? What's the percentage of performance? So do we have high performers that are doing these jobs, or are they low performers that are doing these jobs? So different ways to think about some of the same concepts. Brendan, anything to add to that second question as you think about role segmentation?
Yeah, absolutely. Just to put a plug in there for the importance of that role segmentation. That's something that some of our leading customers are really putting energy towards, not just in the context of workforce planning, but really in also the context of just analysis of the organization on an ongoing basis, and really coming up with some interesting things. As an example, do we have individuals in a strategic role or segment that in fact we're borrowing, so we're outsourcing it? Is that the best decision? And so as we went along the process of figuring out how to design our planning solution, it was really with the idea of reducing friction between bringing data in from your talent and people systems, as well as the analytics that you have to do so that you can inform that process, so that capability and capacity can be easily brought into the planning process to inform decisions. So that's definitely what we've heard from customers is important in that planning process, and certainly how we've designed the solution to ensure that that they've got that information with the lowest amount of effort and friction possible, so they can spend time on the value add side of it, which is figuring out what your segments are, and then how to go about the planning process to really leverage those segments in the best way possible.
What is the biggest, if you had to think about a bit of advice for people as they think about how to do that, anything you could provide in terms of what you tell your clients on making this process work effectively?
I think one of the aspects, particularly on the scope of segmentation, it's such a large thing to approach, is to start maybe with the as I think you sort of highlighted, what are the roles that have the greatest potential impact to pull levers within the organization to influence performance. And sometimes that means starting kind of big, like, who are my customer-facing individuals and who are my support individuals, and starting there and then starting to work downwards in terms of granularity to the point that it makes sense in terms of, what are strategic roles, what are misaligned, but at least getting to that point, if you're, say, an organization that's looking to be more customer focused, understanding like what's the volume of people that we actually have in front of the customers, and what are our plans, or what do we need our plans to be to grow that segment versus the support individuals. And so kind of looking at it, that larger picture can be sometimes easier to bite off and show value to leadership in terms of the insights they can get and the way that they can plan, and then start to really, figure out how to go deeper and deeper and deeper successively down to, populations that might be much smaller in the organization.
Yeah, that's good counsel. Thank you, Brendan. I think that in addition to Brendan's ideas there and actually just building on them, I think one of the things people run into as they think about role segmentation is worrying a little bit too much about the labeling of them. Is it a strategic role, or is it a core role, or do we call it a critical role? The part of the reason why Tracy Smith calls all of them roles of interest is to get past that. So you don't have to have this discussion about, well, which one is which. But you do need a way to say, these matter more to us for right now anyway, and we're going to focus there and do some of the things that Brandon talked about, so being able to pull that data together. So the last of the questions gets into this sort of longer term element. So strategic workforce planning, in our estimation, is about a couple of different things. It's mostly looking at the environment. So this is our model, by the way. This is the model that gets taught in the Strategic Workforce Planning certification from HCI. And it begins with business strategy. Where's the organization trying to go? And it moves from that into role segmentation in the way that we've just talked about. But then it takes that concept and provides an external layer to it. And whichever version of megatrends research you like, by all means, pick your own. A couple of years ago, PricewaterhouseCoopers did very nice research about global megatrends. Every year, the big consulting companies seem to update it a bit. But there are some things that are happening out on our planet, folks, that are really, really important to get our head around. Things like increased urbanization. As cities grow, the ability to get to work every day becomes more and more problematic. Well, whose problem is that? In some respects, it's HR's problem. It's our ability to figure out how to get work done in an efficient way in which people are oftentimes commuting an hour and a half each day in both directions. And so the reason that the environment scan is important is that there are things that are happening out there in the external environment that are very much going to shape our business plan. And if we're not careful, then it may derail us. We may begin to lose credibility in a variety of different ways, and maybe even lose the relevance of our business. And we don't have to look very far to look at organizations that have succumbed to this. The Fortune 500 is made up of companies that didn't exist even 15 or 20 years ago, and lots of companies that were in the Fortune 500 15 years ago are gone today. So as you think about that, we need to think about, and this isn't meant to be all doom and gloom, but it is meant to say, in order to be able to think long term, 3 to 5 years out, we have to take a good look at what's happening in the external environment. And environment scanning is about that. It is meant to be a regular process. It is clear that it can certainly impact many different parts of the strategic plan or the strategic workforce planning world. And this is an example of HCI's environment scan template. It's, I think, very usable. We use it all the time, but you certainly could come up with different ways to do this. There are 4 different boxes here that are worthwhile to think about, though, in terms of external or really factors overall. I'll start at the bottom left because it's the place that it is easiest in terms of thinking about things to do. In the bottom left quadrant of an environmental scan, it looks sort of like a SWOT analysis if you've done these before. It's a little different, though. So the bottom left is what the organizational strategy is. It's the demand side of internal demand. So as we think about the things that go in the left box, this is your business strategy. It's who we want to go, where we want to go. It's expansions into global markets that we haven't been before. It's the ability to launch a new product. There are things that are going to be in this left-hand box that sort of define where it is that you want to go. And it's going to define what kinds of people that you need. On the bottom right box, this is your current state. So these are the employees that you have. You could think of these bottom left boxes as being what you have on the left and what you need on the right. I'm sorry, what you need on the left and what you have on the right. And so the employees box is very much your current state data. As you move up to the top right in an environment scan, you're thinking about factors that are related to the external supply of talent. And this is why it's often good, if you're working on workforce planning, to try to get the folks that are in your talent acquisition function to participate with you, because their knowledge of the external labor market is probably as good or better than most other parts of the organization. They work on filling these jobs on a regular basis. They can tell you what the availability of key skills is, how long it's likely to take to get people, whether there are capabilities that are almost non-existent. You know, that top right box is important to get our head around, and that's very much looking at the external labor market. And then last but not least is the top left box. And this goes to the rest of the world environment. So are there big economic changes that are happening out there? Are there changes in political regulations? I mentioned the changes in the Affordable Care Act that are underway earlier. Are there things that are happening in terms of geopolitical unrest that are going to affect our business plans? All of these boxes are really important as we think about the availability of those key skills we talked about, not just today, but in the future. So these are just a couple slides that go into each one of these. I think I covered most of this, so I'll move over this slide. There are 3 key ways to gather information that might be useful to you as you think about your environment scan. The first of them is external customers. And those of us in HR probably don't get an opportunity to talk to our external customers as much as we might like, though in some sectors you probably do. But external customers can tell you a lot about what your product or service is doing well, and probably what your competitor's product and service is doing well, and probably why they chose you versus them, but why they might choose them next time. Those are good inputs to have from your external customers. Internal stakeholders can also tell you a lot. So if you have regular conversations with your salespeople about what's resonating with the market, regular people with operations about gaps in the process and how long things take. Last but not least, I'm not here to sell subscriptions to you, but I do think the Wall Street Journal is probably a good source. It's a good way to understand the financial and business implications to a lot of the different external factors that are happening out there. And so these can all be useful to you. The idea of futuring is very much thinking about kind of how to take those potential things in the environment scan and apply a layer to them that allows you to think about possible futures. And it's a fairly detailed process, folks, that we wouldn't be able to go through even if we had the whole hour to do it. But I do want to give you a sense of kind of what scenario planning and futuring is all about. It's very much starting with what happens if we don't do anything. That's what's at the top right of the slide. It's the no change future state. If we didn't do anything about any of our gaps today, this is what would happen to us. It's then taking a variety of different possible versions of the future and thinking about what all of those might be to arrive at a targeted future state that helps you identify where you want to go. This is the way these three different concepts work together. We've talked about how we get to environment scans, and we think about a variety of different factors. Out of those factors, we create multiple narratives that describe different versions of the future. And then out of those, we get to this concept of a targeted future state. So that's the end of the third question. Brandon, I want to come back to you and see if you have any thoughts about the overall concept of strategic workforce planning, and then we'll tie maybe these three things together.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think first of all, you hit the nail on the head when you mentioned participation. I think when I talk to people about starting their workforce planning, regardless of whether it's operational or more strategic, it really comes down to participation and collaboration, and it's a team sport in terms of not just HR, but getting really consultative with different organizations in the business. And so to me, that's one of the most exciting things is how the HR organization can become a facilitator, not always in the center per se, but an organization that's really helping to shape the future strategy of the organization and help inform those decisions. And so, as we looked at how we wanted to incorporate planning into how our customers look at their people information and analysis, it made a lot of sense for us to really bring them all together so that you don't spend a lot of time, say, loading data into a planning tool, redefining all of your security, and then mid-cycle having an org change that needs to disrupt everything as you sort of try to reset your plan. And so one of the things that we've really done is tried to tie all that together in terms of the information that you need, and you mentioned not only the information you might need from a traditional source like turnover and vacancy that would come from HR, but also that environmental scan part, and that's so important to the strategic part of planning in terms of being able to incorporate information that might be coming from, say, some of your key lines of business with demand forecasts, and having the flexibility to, say, bring that into your planning and collaborative process, as well as the market data. And so what we've really thought to do is set out to say, well, people really plan in, by and large, it's Excel. So how can we make an environment like that in a planning surface that's collaborative so you can chat live with people, but have, as to the data that you know and love within your core systems, and then also turn around and use that for analysis on an ongoing basis to see how well your plan is actually functioning, and maybe where you need to redirect. So I think what I love about what you just said with the third question there is that participation element, because it can't be understated how important that is to everything related to planning, whether you're trying to do operational or strategic workforce planning.
Cool. Thanks, Brendan. So I want to pick up a couple things. Let's try to tie these three different things together, see if we can come up with some common threads, and then Brendan and I think we'll try to take a few questions from the audience and see if there are some things that we can answer. But this is if we have a formula for success, this is it for formula at HCI's certification course anyway. We tend to think about 4 or 5 things as being really critical to the concept of workforce planning, and I would count most of these as true kind of across the board. One of them is executive sponsorship. No surprise here. Most initiatives and organizations don't move very far without somebody in the executive ranks saying, yeah, this is pretty important. But in particular, because the whole idea of workforce planning is to adjust, you're going to have to do some things. And sometimes if you want to do things and your business unit leaders are not in support of doing these things, the initiatives around workforce planning don't get very far. A second piece of insight might be this idea of line owned. And what that really means is HR can do a really good job facilitating a workforce planning process. They can provide the right data, giving good systems like Workday. They can come up with good questions. They can go through the environment scan. They can even interpret business strategy and come up with really good insights as to which direction to go in. But none of those things will happen if the line doesn't believe that they're important to execute. And so getting a business leader to not only sort of at the executive level say, yeah, workforce planning is something that we want to spend time on, but at the line level, participate enough to really inform the business strategy discussion so that we can have a real meaningful discussion about those strategic roles. That's where sort of the idea of the theory of workforce planning moves into action, is getting it to be something that the line really participates in. The third piece of advice is that it needs to focus on the language of the business. A focus on lots and lots of HR jargon and HR initiatives will make people come to the conclusion that what this is an HR exercise, and it's not. Workforce planning is meant to be a business exercise, just like it's an extension of the strategic planning that's happening in the organization already. It just brings in the talent lens to it. So being able to speak in the language of the business as opposed to the language of HR is important. And last but not least, change management is important here as well. So, John Kotter talks about his accelerators of change, the change guru from Harvard. Kotter will say the first of those is build a burning platform, help people understand why the status quo doesn't work, and get them to think about ways in which they can do something positive that's going to move the organization forward. And then with those things, strategic workforce planning can take hold. These are a few slides my buddy Glenn Callis, who's the CEO of Camden Delta Consulting, put together. Glenn's a faculty member of ours and also consults on workforce planning. And I thought I'd close with just some things that sometimes cause workforce planning to not happen. And if you think about number one, failure to link it to the business strategy is a big one. Number 10, trying to do too much too soon. I don't know, Brandon, as you look at this list, anything that you see that are reasons why workforce planning doesn't work very well?
I think definitely the number 11, integrate workforce planning into existing processes and rhythms, and sort of really, as you said, it needs to be down at that line of business and participation there with the individuals that understand, say, their future demand and direction. And so, integrating it into their process and making it an interdisciplinary team is just so essential. And it might mean that you start small in terms of not the whole organization. It's those organizations that are really critical to your strategic success going forward, and then you get that credibility to expand. Is kind of how I see it.
Yep, good, agreed. All right, folks. Well, let's. I think we've got our question slide coming up here. My email address is at the bottom. I'd be delighted to hear from any of you with additional questions I might be able to help with. Brennan, let's see if there are some folks with questions out there.
All right. Thank you, guys. If you haven't yet submitted your questions to those of you in the audience, please do so now using the Q&A box underneath the webcast video player. And the Q&A box has been quite lively, and not because our audio keeps cutting out. It's because people are actually able to hear the content and they're engaging with it. So I'm going to, unfortunately, guys, it looks like we've got too many to answer on the phone or on the broadcast. So, but we'll keep track of them, and of course, Bill's email is right there if you want to get further information too. So, starting right at the top here, I've got one from Jen. She wants to know on the operational versus strategic workforce planning slide that was from earlier in the presentation. How do you define business plan? I'll toss that one up to Bill, and Brandon, you can sound off afterwards.
Sure. Well, I think we would define business plan in that slide anyway as being the strategic plan of what the organization's trying to do. Now, I don't know whether that's written or whether it's something that articulates where your organization is trying to go. But as I recall from that slide, it's the output of one of the particular pieces. So if you think about operational workforce planning, what we're really trying to do is to drive the insights that are going to allow us to come up with a business plan. And that business plan, again, might be written out. It might be something that is articulated in a variety of different ways. But that would be my answer to the question.
No, I think that's great. We'll take more questions. I think you covered it.
All right.
I think just very quickly, I mean, I think business plan, like Bill said, is often written down or articulated, maybe not, but it's going to be more in that shorter term for, say, the next fiscal year. Whereas your strategic plan is looking at big picture. The FP&A organization and others are looking at what are we going to be doing 3 to 5 years from now as a corporation, and really looking at it with that scope and lens.
So a short-term example of the business plan might be, we're going to open 3 new locations in the tri-state area this coming year versus the strategic plan being, we're going to go to Asia.
Precisely,
yes.
Yeah. Bigger picture, longer scope.
Yep.
Yeah, and usually, Alan, with some financial numbers attached. So
right.
In the short term, you're going to be looking at, okay, we're going to grow these 3 places. We're going to have 3 new products, and they're going to produce X amount of revenue.
Right. Yeah, I think that's very helpful context there. Okay, so I want to get to another question here. Here's a question from Renan, and hopefully I'm pronouncing your name right. How would you go about measuring the number of people needed in structures, like actual physical facilities, that are performing similar activities? Like the examples Renan gives are hospitals, schools, that kind of thing. How would you go about projecting that the rough number of people you would need to run something where there's a lot of similar facilities that you're planning on staffing?
Brendan, you want to start with that one, and I'll weigh in?
Yeah, definitely. So, if I were to take hospitals or schools, oftentimes there's a fairly well-defined metric of, say, teachers and support staff based on anticipated enrollment. And so there, an organization would be looking at something like, what's the population growth in the area in which I happen to operate? What do those projections look like over the next several years? It might be based on historical growth rates or a variety of things from the environmental scan, and then trying to apply those same metrics. Same with like hospitals. Usually you've got some metric that you're trying to staff your emergency room versus other areas, and so that demand model, that forecast, becomes incredibly important to then looking at what are your target supply metrics, and then how do you go about that. So it often is pretty granular and detailed, for sure.
Yeah, I would, I'd add 2 things to that. One is some organizations, actually earlier in the Ross Sparkman presentation that you guys saw, he actually went with a statistical model of this and actually ran a regression function looking at a lot of different variables that can contribute to business demand, and then went through the probability of approach to try to figure it out. I think that's a good thing. I think you would also, though, and I do want to have a shout out to what Brendan said earlier, this ability to build partnerships with people is critical in this process, because what most organizations or people that talk about workforce planning would want to do there is to go facility to facility and talk to the people that are running the shop and say, how many do we have at peak levels? How many? What do we think our anticipated sort of busyness is going to be? How much do we think we're going to need these folks, and then adjust from there. But working with the local leaders, I think, is particularly important there.
Yeah, it was interesting. Somebody in the comments also, or the Q&A box, mentioned a little something. They're asking about, can data from Prism be brought in from call center data around the volume of calls you're getting to determine the headcount you need? So it's kind of touching on a similar theme there, Bill, of like, not just talk to the local leaders, but also get some data wherever you have it about what kind of volume of work you're getting. However, the best way to manage that would be depending on the industry and the job type.
That's right. Yeah.
Right. And that one sounds like it's probably a Workday customer, specifically Prism being our analytics tool. And just to address that directly, absolutely. I mean, that's the alignment there, is being able to bring in data to our analytics and then tie it straight into a workforce planning model, but at the same time have it available for analytics at any time, not just during planning cycles. So however you get it into your planning process, Workday customer or not, that context is incredibly important.
Of course. And then I'll let this be probably our last question. So I'm going to pick something nice and big and broad. And this one is from Steve Whites. Apologies to you, Steve, and your forebears if I mispronounce that. If strategic business planning is not very rigorous, how can we influence this so that workforce strategy can be established? No change, future state, he suggests.
Yes. In fact, that is the exact answer. I think you have to look at this. And obviously, Steve, I don't know what you mean by workforce planning not being rigorous, but if it's not happening and people aren't acting on it, the no change future state is your easiest burning platform. You need to be able to create a clear picture of why the uncertainty around how many people you're going to have is dangerous to your organization. And if you can't do that, then it would be difficult to tie into it, because and workforce planning is going to feel like this big data exercise that nobody has time for. So I think the answer to your question is you're going to need to be able to let people see the risk that your organization faces by not knowing the answer to what their both headcount plans in the short term, operational, and longer term are going to need to be from a business perspective. Then on that one.
Sorry, actually, Steve's question was slightly different, but I think you actually answered it anyways. But he said, if strategic business planning is not very rigorous, how can you influence this? So if the business isn't even doing their job to plan for its own future, first of all, Steve, you might be in bigger trouble than you think. But but I think Bill's point stands that that no change future state is probably a helpful way you can get them focused on the future of their people strategy and their business strategy. What do you think of that?
Yeah, and I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, just to chime in there, as far as is informing that and creating that burning need, sometimes that's it. At first, the straight, I'll call it analytics in terms of like what's the current state of the organization, and really calling out those elements that become quite vital to motivate planning. So one of them being, say, what is the volume of your potential retirees in some of the, key areas of the business. So you may be able to alert your leadership through some of that analysis to the fact that there's a burning need to actually conduct some planning, and then for them to start looking at the overarching business strategy based on some of those factors that are coming in from your people side.
Excellent. Well, I think that's a good note to end on here, and I'm sorry we couldn't get to everybody's questions, but you have the slide deck on the website, and you can bombard Bill with with all of your questions after we sign off here today. So, of course, I want to thank Bill and Brandon and all the good people at Workday for making this possible, and of course you, the audience. And I want to direct everybody back to make sure you come back soon to the website, hci.org. You can find all sorts of excellent content, not just webcasts, but podcasts, articles, white papers, research blogs, and conferences and classes. So you can get, if you want more Bill, sign up for a class. There's a pretty good chance you might get more. So with that, I think we're going to sign off for today and wish everybody a pleasant rest of it.